our Latin. Good, thank you. A warm welcome to you all to our Latin American history seminar. And could I just please mute your micros? That's the only continue camera, but I think my micros ought to be muted. Thank you. Um, gives me a great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today, um, Dr. Erika Denise Edwards and Celso Tomás Castillo. Erika is an associate professor of Latin American history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And she's been there, I think, after she completed her PhD at Florida International University. She's the author of the book Hiding in Plain Sight, Black Women and the Law and the Making of a White Argentine Republic, published by the University of Alabama Press. And that is the book that will be the subject of our tertulia today. And the book has won several prizes, including the Association of Black Women Historians 2020, the Tisha Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize, and named one of the Black Perspective Best Black History in 2020. She is going to be talking about her book with Celso Tomás Castillo, a great supporter of this seminar and a good friend of the seminar. He's an associate professor at history at Vanderbilt University. He completed graduate school at the University of Berkeley, where he began work on slavery and abolition in Brazil. His book, Slave Emancipation and Transformation in Brazilian Political Society, connects the history of abolition with that of civil society, the public sphere, elections, and indeed, the history of Brazilian democracy in extraordinary ways. And my students know the book quite well. He's now, again, received several prizes, but his current project includes a study of the circulation of Uncle Tom's Cabin in Latin America. And he's also working on the intellectual and cultural history of Black press in 19th century. And his book, co-edited book, Press, Power, and Culture in Imperial Brazil, is due to come published during the summer. I hope we can have him here later discussing that. At the moment, he's going to talk with Erika Edwards on her recent book. So welcome, Erika and Celso. Many thanks for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning here from Nashville. Good afternoon to everybody at Oxford and around the world. It's a great pleasure to be here. Eduardo, thank you so much for this invitation and this opportunity. I couldn't be more excited to be engaging and starting this conversation with Professor Edwards. As those of you that also work in the larger field of slavery and African diaspora will know, Professor Edwards has had the wonderful chance to give a lot of talks, and I was delighted to hear yesterday in her other presentation that the book's already sold out. So that's fantastic. I mean, within it can't be more than 8-10 months, and this book is already sold out. So that's wonderful news, both for her and of course for the University of Alabama Press. To kind of help us set the stage a little bit for this conversation that is both about hiding in plain sight, but also larger discussion about Blackness and Black politics in Argentina. I wanted to ask Professor Edwards, can you tell us who is and why do we need to know about Maria Remedios del Valle, and how is she still a touchstone for conversations about Blackness in Argentina today?
Definitely. Well, first and foremost, I also want to thank Eduardo and the Latin American Center for this invitation. This is a great honor to be able to discuss this. And again, good afternoon, early afternoon for those of us in Eastern Standard Time, and then good evening to those that are tuning in at 5 p.m. UK time. So Maria Remedios del Valle is a very unique figure, and one that we continue to talk about and write about because of the role that she played in the making of the Argentine nation. Most recently, I co-published a book chapter with Florence Gonzalez about her experiences, and ultimately, she was born or late 18th century and ultimately died in 1847 on November 8th. November 8th today is the day of Afro-Argentines and Afro culture in Argentina, and they specifically chose that date to commemorate her death. She is now today known as the mother of the nation. And so oftentimes, I preface it with the Black mother of a white nation. And I think that's very powerful when we think about the way Argentina has been construed, and the image that many people have is that it's often lacking in many ways, various levels of mixture and diversity that we may find in other Latin American countries. And so it's often equivalent or equated to being a very white nation. But to have a woman who ultimately fought in the wars of independence, who earned in many ways the title captain from Manuel Belgrano, was captured, took 6 bullets to her body, 9 days of being whipped because she helped others escape, eventually finds her way back to BA from being in Alto Peru. And what is amazing about her story, and this is what we have now, Florencia and I have looked at, is the fact that we have white officers, prominent officers, that came to her defense and testified about her actions in order for her to receive a pension. And so that story is extraordinary, and one in which I think really encapsulates the Black experience in Argentina in many ways, often, as my title of my book suggests, very much hidden in plain sight. And luckily, because of activists and scholars, her story now is coming forth. And again, we'll be reminded on an annual basis, November 8th of every year.
That's great. That's fascinating. And for everybody that, this is the wonderful new collection that also just came out that features Erika's and Florence Guzman's chapter on Maria Remedios del Valle. So speaking of Florence Guzman and this collaboration that behind this publication, can you talk a little bit more about your interactions with the scholarship produced in Argentina, in the Southern Cone as a whole, and maybe some of the ways that it's kind of influenced your thinking about this project?
Definitely. So Florencia Guzman, I've admired her work for years. And so when she agreed to co-author this chapter with me, I was ecstatic. One of the things that I really enjoy about Florencia's work is that she has really put what many would call the interior experience, or anything outside of, in many ways, BA on the map in regards to Black experiences. So she's been looking at Catamarca for years. And for that, I've always enjoyed looking at her work, reading her work, and dissecting her work in many ways. And it influenced how I also then looked at Cordoba. Another key factor was when I would go to Cordoba, I made sure that I engaged with the scholars there as well. So I got involved in many of the research teams led by Monica Giardi, for example, and I wanted to make sure that I was engaging with what they had already produced. Great scholarship. Dora Selton is another person who I also worked with, and Titina Ferreira, who I'm grateful for her, because after I'd left, she continued to send me some information so I could complete chapter 6. So it was important that I engaged with the scholarship. I wanted to make sure that people knew that, and especially my bibliography, it privileges in many ways Argentine scholars that have worked on Black history, because the information is there. And you still hear people, oh, that not a lot has been worked upon it. Yeah, actually, yes, there is. They've done some really great, brilliant work. And so that was one of the things I wanted to make sure that I constantly did, was to engage with them and to add to the conversation, not repeat it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think at that point that you were making at the very end there about, there has been a lot done, right? And maybe not a lot compared to other places insofar as how back it goes, but I certainly think, and Guzman's a perfect kind of lead into also like Keala, right? I mean, this is something that when just kind of, as somebody that doesn't work in Argentina, just, I just kind of spent time on the website. I'm sure you've interacted in person, right? But 5 conferences since 2010, right? And several of these conferences, I was lucky to get, one of the volumes here, the Cartografías Latinoamericanas. 2 of these have come out, and this is more for the wider public, of course, and 2 recent workshops, one in 2016, another one in 18, that, that was the backbone of this other publication, De la Sede de la Libertad, which are sophisticated studies that, they're all a chapter. Sure, of course, it's a book chapter, but behind that book chapter, we're talking about master's thesis, doctoral theses, monographs, right? And so I think that for the wider, both kind of English, Latin American history, and then also African diaspora publics, like this is really, really crucial. And it's not, what impresses me is that it's not just information about a place that we haven't studied. I think they're taking up, some central questions with race specifically, and of course your work intersects with that and highlights different directions with gender. But I just kind of wanted to put that out there as a basis also for our conversation and for potential discussions later. And one of the features that I also saw in this book is that it is, like your work, expanding the geographic focus, right? I mean, so not only does it include other parts of the Southern Cone, Uruguay, of course, and Chile, but other parts of Argentina with chapters on Corrientes, on Carmen de Patagones, right? So, so it is, again, a nice expansion and broadening of the field and perspective, while taking on different themes, right? So I guess without further ado, let's launch into what we're here for today, right? Hiding in plain sight. And I think it, such a rich and provocative study of, this problem of Black invisibility. She leads off Professor Edwards leads off the conclusion, right, with Black women were the protagonists in their own erasure, right? And this is a key theme and argument delineated throughout the book. So I was going to ask you, so how did this focus come to be? And if maybe you can give us an example of how you worked through it in the book.
I don't know who that is. I'm sorry, that was my husband.
Okay.
You should know better. Sorry. So I apologize. So, oh my goodness.
It's okay.
I'm so sorry. I apologize.
No, it's okay. I mean, I live in the university setting, so I'm subject to having a fire alarm going off at any moment here. So, so I hope there's no exams that somebody's trying to get short today. It's all yours.
So thank you. So the way about which I looked at and understood the focus of Black women in Argentina, and specifically Cordoba, is, well, it came from kind of this explosion in 2014 about the question of the soccer team and why they were lacking Black players. And I was already looking at and working on something else, more of a legal identity that was coming forth in Cordoba, something that I looked at with my dissertation. But I was shocked that still, at least within popular circles, that question of disappearance was so prevalent, because academics, both those in Argentina and the United States that look at Black history in Argentina, we've kind of moved on from that. And so I decided then that I wanted to go ahead and look at that and explore the so-called disappearance, and specifically this notion of invisibility. Mm-hmm. So a couple things then came forward. One is recognizing that Rita Andrews had written the book in many ways in 1980. So I wanted to continue with Cordoba in order to also allow for and explain in many ways that Blackness and the creation of Blackness is diverse. So it's not a homogeneic type of identity that can be applicable to all of the Rio de la Plata and specifically of Argentina. So looking at the cultural, sociocultural, socioeconomic differences do, in effect, ultimately help with the construction of Blackness. So that was one thing I wanted to do. Another thing I wanted to do was move it to an earlier period, as most of the studies have been looked at in regards to the Black experience and the question of disappearance has been about, roughly the late 19th century. So what is happening pre this notion of blancamiento, and how do we get there?
Mhm.
And then lastly, one of the things I wanted to do is look at her. And I stress her because, again, the scholarship in many ways, good scholarship, has oftentimes privileged Black male experiences, and especially during the wars of independence and what that looks like. And I wanted to engage scholarship, Marta Goldberg, Sylvia Macho, of course, Florencia Guzman, and look at what is she doing then in the city of Cordoba. So that's kind of where it all came about. And so I had to actually almost start from scratch in many ways with the research that I had gathered, and really comb through and look at and piece together like a puzzle her experiences, because she always seemed to be in the shadow of Cordoba's archival document. So that took a lot of time, but I think that was necessary and important to do. And so, looking at Black invisibility, I also wanted to provide not only a gendered analysis, but also an analysis of what is Blackness, or the question of Blackness and racialization of Blackness in the interior. So all that together combined ultimately created this book. And then when I decided to really focus on, I had to give and recognize the political space of the household, which is something Michelle McKinley has looked at in her book, Fractional Freedoms in Peru. And that was also a very illuminating experience, because then that's where I started to see more of a collective understanding of this movement towards whiteness, rather than a more individual and possibly masculine understanding of this movement towards whiteness. So kind of all that came together, and that's where I decided to look at, in many ways, these characters or these roles as concubines, wives, mothers, and daughters in this creation of the Cordobese Republic, and ultimately the making of race throughout Argentina.
And it's impressive your use of and crossing of ecclesiastical and legal cases, right? To kind of, like you said, get into both household spaces and also the wider kind of social networks that they afford us a wider glimpse into. It was my experience, and I can imagine it to be the experience of a lot of people. And it was probably one of your most kind of revealing and rewarding chapters to write about Bernabella. Can you tell us a little bit about her and the relationship with the vicar, and how that her story illuminates some of these questions about performance and mobility, and what it tells us about Cordoba too, right?
Definitely. Okay, so this was a amazing case that I stumbled upon in the Arzobispado, and I will forever be grateful to the staff there that just opened up their doors and allowed me to just take and get as much as I needed. So thank you always to them. So this was a case that is probably about 200-300 pages long, and what you're getting is just a glimpse of it for the book. I got so into it. One of my colleagues finally had to say, stop transcribing it. You have to finish the book. You can go back to that later, which I plan to do. So here we have this woman who is a slave, and she has a daughter, and the priest ultimately purchased her and the daughter roughly the late 18th century. And right away, the case goes into the fact that he was just enamored with her beauty. And one of the things that they talk about is that, she is white like a Spanish woman.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, it becomes an amorous relationship. One, of course, that is causes a scandal of, you know, of major proportions because of the fact that here you have this vicar that has no qualms with making their relationship public rather than keeping it private. And I thought that was very interesting. It wasn't so much that they were having an affair, because many priests and clergymen throughout Cordoba and the colonial period in general did oftentimes have a lover. The issue that they had was, you know, how dare he make it public and normalize that behavior. And so this goes back and forth for years. I've got about 10 years or so, and they get caught again, and then they run to the Sierra, and then she gets banished to Buenos Aires, and he finds her again and sends her chocolates. I mean, it's a wonderful, it could be a telenovela possibly, because it's so entertaining, and yet this is the truth, you know. And what I found then in regards to how she came forward, and in terms of, and as the chapter says, from slave to senora, is the performance that she put forth, right? And that's why it's her best performance in many ways, because she ultimately took hold of and emulated what is a senora. And what's important to note, and I think this is must be stressed, is that it's not just her encapsulating this and having the ability to emulate her as individual act. It's the fact that she had his support, right? These social networks that ultimately, to some extent, encourage that behavior. That is what was key. And so, and as slaves would come forward and say, you know, she demanded that we call her senora, and the vicar also, you know, put forth that they do so as well. So there was a backup, or essentially, you know, it's not just her saying this, but she has the support of him to do it. The fact that she's riding in the carriage and he's coming to the front door, for example, or as I loved reading, you know, demanding that they give her chocolate in bed. These are all things that really speaks to how this association with and connection with powerful Spanish men, right, could allow for her to ultimately transcend until they crossed the ultimate, you know, line, which was, it's now starting to, and the case would go into, bother real senoras that are jealous. They would say they're jealous of their privilege and their status and keep it closely guarded. So we have to stop this. And that to me was very telling then, to look at, again, how calidad could be very performative, but also protected by powerful men oftentimes.
And I think one of the, you know, important points that you stress through this case and other examples that you develop is, you know, you avoid idealizing this process of social ascent, or you know, an improvement of a situation, because you're very clear that this isn't available to all, or you know, I'm not sure even to most Afro women in the city of Cordoba, right? And in doing so also kind of entailed an adherence to different ideas about patriarchy. So it was important, I think, that you kind of connected these 2 points, right? That the whiteness and patriarchy and these questions of mobility were intertwined. I liked it, and I found it instructive. Of course, this is maybe coming from somebody that studies Brazil, but you do reference in your book, you know, the Chica da Silva, Junior Furtado's book, and you know, one of the things that strikes me about that book, that in addition to her own story, the story of her children is also illustrative of the limits to those kinds of ascents, right? So, and the roles of mothers in particular in your book being so central. What can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of how it shaped your thinking about questions of Blackness and mobility, motherhood, and also what you can speculate about the potential horizons for the kids?
I think motherhood was central, if not pivotal, to looking at and understanding social mobility and this attempt at adopting whiteness or otherness, as the book shows. And I was quite pleasantly surprised to see this movement from Blackness to brownness or to becoming Indian as well. So I think that really helped me to continue to think of the household, this private versus public, these questions of what does this mean in terms of her identity and how she goes about mobilizing herself and strategizing and thinking about it, how and ways to manipulate at times the law, is that she is constantly inspired by and moved by thinking of a better life for her child. And I think that is something possibly universal for a lot of mothers throughout time and even today, is you're thinking of, I want a better life for them. And so when I looked at motherhood specifically, two things came about. One was what they were willing to do. So Celso, I do appreciate that you highlighted that the book did go into attempts of Afro-descended women who did not try to claim levels of whiteness or levels of being Indian, but actually, came forth as themselves to try and in a particular case of Maria de la Cruz, free her daughter from an abusive relationship with another priest. And unfortunately, it did not work out. It did, but I think it's important to stress that yes, for many Afro-descended women, even when they attempted to move forward, it was, if they did not play within the rules of patriarchy and within the rules of the very conservative culture, oftentimes they did not succeed. So I think that's important to stress, but still it's her love for her child, her willingness to go without a defender of the poor in front of the court and plead that she be free, her willingness to transgress jurisdiction and not care of the consequences was very powerful when I read that case. And then the other aspect of motherhood was also looking at maternity and this maternal line. And that was very key when I looked at and saw these cases in which these mothers would, in order to escape or evade potential enslavement, put forth claims that they are actually of indigenous descent through the maternal line. So you're seeing also these old, very, old colonial lines of hereditary, not hereditary, but of, I would say bloodlines and questions of inheritance in terms of who they are and their identity moving through generations. You see that also coming forth in Cordoba, which I thought was quite brilliant when I looked at these cases. And one in particular, again, her being a mother, arguing and showing that she was of the Pampas, she would argue, and her grandmother had served for many years in the household, but always as a free person. And using that tactic well into the Republican period in order to earn her freedom in a sense, because she was trying to avoid capture or becoming enslaved, but not just for herself, but also then for her children as well as her grandchildren. So you're seeing again this line of freedom also being continued for this family. So I thought it was very powerful when I looked at motherhood and the strengths of these mothers. And also the political meaning of motherhood, this notion of Republican motherhood. And that was the last chapter where I looked at education and how the state, the Cordoba-based apparatus, secular as well as ecclesiastical, now looked for these girls and looked for, by 1811, these Pardo girls to be a part of creating a more socially stable, socially stable society, especially as the midst of the independence movement was growing, and that she was going to be pivotal in creating and molding future citizens. So motherhood is definitely a part of most of the chapters, but I think in general, it's just one of those central understandings of what a mother is willing to do for her child. And in the end, for Bernabella, for example, who is not going to be able to marry her priest, but was able to, they did have a child. They did not survive, but they did have a child, and was able to put him in the book of baptisms for Españoles. So that was one of the ways in which they could at least ensure that the child would have a better future, one that was completely different. Without doubt, as some of these freedom cases would oftentimes cite or look for the baptismal record. Well, in the case of if that child had survived, and also her previous daughter, I should say, Maria, she had found a way to put her in the book of baptisms for Spanish people forever. If there's any doubt, they could always go to that legal document and find her there.
Yeah. No, and it's wonderful. And I definitely want to get to that chapter and focus on education in a second. But when you started to talk about family genealogies and the ways that indigeneity was also drawn upon and discussed, and then as the book kind of unfolded and in hearing you talk in other settings as well, I couldn't help but wonder and want to hear more. Maybe this is also drawing on research that didn't make it into the book per se, right? But Cordoba seems to be also an interesting vantage point into, this larger kind of Andean space with different connections and whatnot. And so I'm wondering what and how would you maybe connect or use what the study of slavery, the study of Black women in particular in this book, and its relationships and ties to indigenous and native history, right? Because these are themes that are definitely there, and so I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that, if there's stuff to share about that maybe didn't make it into the book.
Thank you. Yeah, like I said, it was a surprise. When I found these court cases, I was shocked to know that not only did they claim Indian identity, but they were successful in becoming free. Mm-hmm. And I was shocked at how late they were. Well, late in terms of it happening in the Republic. So, you got the finishing of one in 1817. You have another one in 1825. And I'm thinking, goodness, this is, a bit late for these, colonial legacies to still be active in Cordoba. But again, that's telling of Cordoba and its culture and such. So it actually made me go back and look at and understand and research more about the Indio experience in Cordoba. So I didn't want to go too far in that direction because that's not what the book is about. I wanted to continue to make sure that Black women were the protagonists. But what I found, and some of the things that did not make it into the book, was how also legally savvy they were. Mm-hmm. And so I did find court cases and questions in terms of their water rights and land rights, and how that was constantly a back and forth with this, what used to be an encomienda, but it was called La Toma, which was eventually annexed into the city. But it was right next to the city, and this going back and forth constantly about who had access and how they would have access to the water. Another thing that I found very interesting, and I did touch on it very briefly, is the differences or the legal identities that would happen between those that were of Afro descent versus those that were indigenous. I only found at least 2 instances, and there may be more, beyond my period of study, especially the earlier period, in which I had African descended people go to the actual pueblos and live amongst them because they found that was a better experience for them. And then the conflict that would arise, I did highlight one in which they are not fully, a full-blooded, as they would say, Indio. So how can they claim or attempt to become the cacique? So you would see that going back and forth as well, which for me was just very telling about the legal identities. Of course, both being very marginalized in the larger sense of social hierarchy, but yet still amongst those that are considered castas, indios, negros, there is still this kind of internal hierarchy that was always at play. So yeah, it's something that I definitely want to continue to explore, especially the experience of the Pueblo La Toma, which, you know, I found even conversations of going back and forth with the state as late as the 1880s. But yes, in general, I did not go that far into it because I wanted to make sure that she stayed a protagonist. But it is a history. It's a very rich history. And I think this is one avenue that we should continue to explore, those that are that do colonial Argentina, because of that connection to the Andean region. I mean, already naturally speaking, it being this epicenter in the middle of the Rio de la Plata that connected in many ways the coast, but also the economy, the subsidiary economies that develop because of the mule trade. I mean, that is Cordoba up through, you know, northwestern, what is today northwestern Argentina and upper Peru, and that shared conversation and culture of indigenous experiences definitely still needs to be explored more.
And it was a theme that you know, you introduced very vividly in the very beginning. I think as you're walking us through the central plaza of Cordoba and the cathedral, right? And you're like, who built this, right? And I think that was very evocative of the way the two stories are more intertwined than has been written about. And so I saw that as a promising direction, I think, for continued engagement for other people, you know, thinking about these two histories, because I would venture to say that there's also a lack of engagement on the other end, right? Insofar as, oh, I work on, you know, X, but I don't connect Y, and as you're suggesting, insofar as legal culture, insofar as just understandings of the law, these kinds of cases are coming from different groups, and anyway, so it's illustrative of these connections, and you know, you write about in your last two chapters about this kind of emerging Pardo identity, right? In this kind of first few decades of the 19th century, that means something specific in Cordoba, right? That's kind of, it encompasses an array of groups. So if maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how that story is part of the story of education, I think, in important ways that you're identifying that we need to pay more attention to.
So yeah, essentially what I did was I took all of the city census data available. So there's 4, 1778, 1813, 1822, 1832, and actually 1840. So there's 5. And I transcribed all of them, which took a lot of time. But one of the things I saw was, you know, as the Republican period progressed up through 1832, this term Pardo started to encapsulate everyone that seemed to be something other than what was now essentially going to be described being blanco or noble. Spanish will drop off after the 1813 census because of the wars of independence, and now no one wants to be a Spaniard, so to speak. But clearly everyone still wants to have and ascribe to levels of whiteness when possible. So that privilege clearly still carries. So at a certain point, I found that it was almost 50-50. And I was thinking to myself, what is going on here? So I went back, and because I transcribed them, I was able to trace the lives of some of these people, some that had started out as African slaves, literally staying Angola, for example, and enslaved, are now going to be, first Pardo esclavos, eventually Pardo libres. And another example I found was also this Indios, which also I said that's telling of how they are this notion of being Indian, this so-called privilege that they may have had in the colonial period is now starting to vanish in some ways, and so they are also becoming Pardos, mestizos, mulattoes. You know, I'm seeing 0% by 1822, definitely 1832, and I'm thinking, where did they go? And so this was important to highlight and discuss because this again shows how Blackness and the question of othering is different throughout Argentina. So you have someone like Rita Andrews who argues, and I agree that Pardo still is in reference to Afro descent and squarely Afro descent in Buenos Aires. And that could be possibly because you have a slave trade that continues longer, at least in terms of where they are going. They're staying in Buenos Aires. So, you have Alex Baruchi's book, which brilliantly showed that it's actually the latter part, the late 18th, early 19th century, where you see a large amount of slaves coming to the shores of the Rio de la Plata. But I see that they're not going to Cordoba. Okay, so they're mainly staying in BA, possibly because of the strong economy. And so you can see how Pardo can still then act in a way as another classification for Blackness. But in Cordoba, that is not the case. It becomes an othering process, and one in which to go into education is about understanding and constructing a different republic. A republic that in many ways is no longer the colonial period, is no longer one that has slaves, as slavery is on a decline throughout the Republican period, but is also an attempt to acknowledge levels of diversity, but in a different way. So here we have now negros, morenos, mulattos, zambos. All of these former castas now are being put forth in a new encompassing category that is almost a bit of a removal from levels of Blackness and definitely of the enslaved, but also continues to be a marker that they are not blanco or noble. And so you see then also how education plays a role in that they still, even though they are not considered to be blancos or nobles, they still have a role in terms of this republic, although it's going to have limitations, right? So in the Constitution that comes forth in 1820, if you are Pardo and free, it stresses free, you can vote if you're 2 generations removed from slavery. You can run for office if you're 4 generations removed from slavery. So there's still these levels of making sure that they don't have the same privileges and rights as those that are blancos and nobles. And I think that's important to stress. For the girls that I studied, her role then would be almost similar to those that were considered to be blancas in the terms of cultivating and creating the ideal citizen. Of course, however, the idea would be that they would be teaching them, levels of social control and obedience and how to be hard workers for the state. So it's all part of, again, we are a republic. We are no longer a colony, but you still see these levels of the colonial legacies are still alive and functioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at where we're at insofar as today's program, I think this is the point where the Eduardo might take over, and I think it looks like we'll open it up. And Erika, I just wanted to thank you again for the opportunity and enriching all of our understanding of this great book. And congratulations, this is wonderful.
Thank you, Celso, and thank you for those great questions.
Well, thank you very much, Celso and Erika, for the conversation. There's a lot there to discuss, and we have plenty of time. As has been our practice in the seminar, there are 2 ways for you to ask questions. One is if you can put your questions in the chat, but you are equally welcome to come and address the question yourself. We prefer to have 1 question at a time just to keep the conversation going. You can certainly come back and ask questions again. So if you want me to call you, just either write question in the chat or use the hand thing there to well, we need to stop the recording, Celso. So if you can do that from your side, that would be